The girlfriend stabbed him in the face with a chef's knife. The X-ray was nuts. Doctors of Reddit, what patient made you go how the fuck are you even alive? We had a guy with a major aortic dissection one night. From the bedside ultrasound, he looked like he had already bled out. He had some chest pain, but he was alert and oriented, and we were shocked he was even still alive. He absolutely shouldn't have been with how much blood we saw and the size of the dissection. We called the surgeon in, who was really blunt and explained to the guy he was probably going to die in surgery. He was a young guy, like the late 40s, he was on a business trip, and it was completely unexpected. He kept trying to call his wife, but it was like 2 a.m. and she wasn't answering. He just wanted to talk and tell her goodbye. It was actually pretty devastating to watch. Meanwhile, he's so coherent and alert as if he isn't actively bleeding out and dying. Most patients we would get in the same situation wouldn't be conscious or would already be dead. They swooped him off to surgery before he could contact his wife, and the dude lived. Remembering that story got me through a lot of tough years in the ER, because I think it just reminded me that hope and good outcomes are still out there. Lady in her mid-30s was in the clinic for a 1-week follow-up post-foot amputation, diabetes. She was admitted straight from the clinic because her blood glucose was 600 mg/dl, normal is 80 to 120, and the wound was severely infected. We used super concentrated doses of insulin to bring it back to the 200s. She was on strict diet restrictions and we couldn't figure out how it wouldn't drop any lower than 250. Turns out her kids, teens, had been sneaking giant 64-ounce sodas and candy bars into the hospital, literally 1 week after we chopped her foot off because of uncontrolled diabetes. Not exactly a case of how the fuck did you survive that trauma/disease, but how the fuck do you even function on your own? I work in trauma and once had a guy fall off a roof. He said he remembered hitting the bars on the scaffolding on the way down. We originally thought he'd fractured his femur, but nope, just a small hematoma. He was in bed next to a man who had broken his ribs and had a small C-spine fracture when he fell forward picking up his keys. I was on home call for ER in a small town, got a call from the ER nurse one night and she was like, EMS brought someone in here and they think she might be dead. I was like, well, is she? She was like, I don't know. This was a seasoned RN, by the way, so I was like, well, guess we're treating this as a code blue kind of situation. So without any further information, I jump into my car and rush over to the hospital. Once I got there, I realized why the triage nurse was so confused. In the trauma bay, lay what appeared to be skeletonized remains under a blanket. The person felt warm to touch, so I opened their eye, and a yellow, wrinkled, shrunken eyeball stared at me and then suddenly moved. The potassium of 1, for those familiar with lab values. The backstory was extreme self-neglect/depression combined with caregiver neglect. Weighed in at 67 pounds at a height of about 5 feet 5 inches. We actually resuscitated her, very aggressively, and unbelievably, after about 8 liters of fluid, she started speaking a word or two at a time and recognized her daughter. As a med student on my emergency rotation, I had a guy brought in who had fallen off a 7th or 8th floor balcony and landed on his head. Essentially DOA, and we couldn't get a blood pressure when he got to the hospital. As a student, my job was to basically stand to the side and squeeze the bazillion bags of blood that went into this dude. His cervical spine was essentially dust on the initial CT scan we got. I figured he probably wouldn't have made it, but about a month later I'm now on my ICU rotation and I see this guy awake and conscious. Pretty crazy. During residency, my ICU patient had to have his chest reopened less than an hour after a 6-hour open heart cath surgery. He needed 12 units of blood, his heart massaged then shocked 4 times. Cardiothoracic surgeon in the ICU operating because no time to go back down to OR. Was an illicit drug abuser and alcoholic. Nurses called him the cockroach. I checked in on him for 4 weeks. He was unresponsive every day. On week 20 we had to consult ENT. To take maggots out of his nose. I was sure he was a goner after that. Week 3 passed, with no change. Week 4, day 24 I believe, at 6 a.m., he opens his eyes. I was shocked. He has a permanent traumatectomy now, but somehow is alive. My dad is 87, he had prostate, liver, bowel, colon, and skin cancer. For skin cancer, he had lots of reconstructive surgeries. his whole tibia region and the back of his hands. Every year he has to have at least one skin lesion removed. He had a couple of heart attacks and then a sextuple bypass surgery. He also had big pneumonia, a huge abscess, and a small stroke. His doctor wants to see him every 6 months. I think just to be amazed that he's still walking around. A guy I took care of during my residency, fucking cyborg. I was the chief of trauma. Got a page about a patient en route with a stab wound to the chest. When the patient rolled into the trauma bay, he had no pulse. He had been stabbed in his left upper chest, 3 centimeters below the clavicle. He got an ER thoracotomy. If you want to feel like a badass, then do an ER thoracotomy. We were able to cross-clamp his aorta. We took him right to the OR. We oversewn one small artery below his rib, then transported him to the ICU still intubated. 8 hours later he was extubated and wanting breakfast. Seriously, dude? He was dead 10 hours before. He was also a complete asshole. No wonder someone stabbed him. When my mom was in her ER cycle during an internship, man with police officers behind him came in the ER. The man was perfectly fine and walking, so my mom and her colleagues were confused. The officers showed them a picture of a crumpled metal piece, which was a car. It didn't look like a car at all, just metal trash. The officers told my mom and her colleagues that they rescued the patient from the car, which was lit on fire only a few seconds after they rescued him. The patient didn't have a single scar on him, was perfectly fine, and got his name around the hospital for being immortal. Currently in residency, but this was a patient I saw in medical school. This one has more to do with a patient's past medical history instead of anything acute. I had one patient in one of my internal medicine rotations who was admitted for hip surgery who was one of the nicest, sweetest people I've ever met. Her surgery was pretty routine and there were no complications. In her past medical history, she was diagnosed with stage 4 endometrial cancer that had spread to her brain. Apparently, she had undergone chemo, radiation, primary tumor resection, and surgery to remove the brain met. She remained cancer-free since that period. The fact that she had undergone that whole ordeal and appeared to be mostly healthy and was in remission from her cancer really blew my mind. A guy, now passed away, who had incurable lung cancer from Agent Orange exposure during infantry service in Vietnam, and his wife had recently died. Cancer. Wife died. The guy was pretty positive, glass half full about chemo, considering the double whammy. I asked him how he managed to keep it on the positive. He said he was returning to base with just days left on his enlistment. The rookie pilot has a mechanical failure of some sort in their Huey. They are going down, and not the controlled kind of landing either. He assumes he is about to die, says everything got real slow, really bright, and a sense of acceptance and peace washed over him. Rookie pulls one out at the last moment, lands their bird with no casualties. The patient told me he felt he should have died that day, and every single day since was a complete gift. Maybe being alive has a lot to do with attitude. Obligatory, not a doctor, but my dad is, and he liked to tell us about the crazy shit he saw. This post made me think of one of those in particular. Huge guy, linebacker build, came into the trauma ward with a gunshot wound dead center of the chest. He could breathe fine and he had a pulse. So they did a chest x-ray and found that the bullet had spent all its energy getting through this guy's sternum and was just resting on his pericardium. Airlifted pregnant female with GSW to the head. Arrived intubated and unresponsive with the bullet lodged in her right occipital lobe. Self-extubated the next day and left the hospital against medical advice 2 days after that with only minor visual deficits. Unbelievable. My father's doctor couldn't believe A, he didn't need to amputate his feet, and B, he was still alive. Dad had brittle diabetes. His pancreas would kick in and out due to a congenital deformity. At 82, he had significant heart issues, including angina, enlarged heart, and clogged arteries. One day, his feet went black. Not just bluish, or gray, black as charcoal, rushed to an emergency. We were told they would amputate, but to say our goodbyes. Dad refused surgery. Said he'd rather be dead, at his age. Hours later, his feet were pink. We took him home that morning. The doctor actually apologized for upsetting us, but said he'd never seen anything like it. We had one of these at an eye doctor's office of all places. The patient was complaining about how her new glasses weren't working, So the doctor took her in back to check to see if the prescription needed tweaking. The doctor came up with a completely different prescription. The patient was overweight but claimed she was not diabetic. The doctor convinced her to let us take a blood sugar measurement with staff members' personal glucose meter. The meter displayed was high. With some arguing, we were able to get her to go to the local hospital right away. I don't remember what her blood sugar level was, but I remember it was the hospital's high score for a while. She should not have been conscious, let alone functioning normally. My mother. We used to live in East Texas and my mom had this lady come in and had a huge infected wound in her leg, like massive to the point they might have to amputate, and she had asked her why she waited so long before coming in when it was obviously festering. Well, turns out this woman was letting her dogs lick it clean because their mouths are clean, and she was soaking it in Dr. Pepper because doctor had her thinking it would help. Needless to say, my mother looked at her like a deer in the headlights when she said that. I had a patient who was literally cut in half at the pelvis after a car hit him and pinned him to a telephone pole. Paramedics carried his legs separately. He was wide awake and talking to me as we quickly put in a central line, and he got all the bleeders ligated by like 5 different surgeons. He declined pain meds repeatedly. What a legend. He was in the OR 5 minutes later. Luckily this was at a major academic center with an exceptional trauma surgery team. Apparently, the guy lived, not sure what his quality of life was after, but pretty crazy. ER doctor. Oh my goodness, so many patients. Too many to tell. One good one, I once took care of a guy in the rural South who came to the hospital because people said he was growing salt. And he was, totally covered in what looked like snow. Uremic frost. I said since I was fresh out of residency. Guy had been in renal, kidney, failure for 3 months and had been vomiting every day, which kept his potassium low enough that he didn't die. But it was still 9.7 and his ECG was a sine wave and he definitely should have been dead. Google uremic frost. It's a good one. EMT here. Brought in a PT whose, now former, girlfriend stabbed him in the face with a chef's knife. The knife went through his right eye, missed his cranial cavity, and stopped about an from his brain stem. The X-ray was nuts. We showed everyone. I had a patient in the emergency room who had been involved in an awful car accident where firefighters and paramedics spent an hour trying to get him out of his car. Reportedly, he attempted to walk to the ambulance, and when he arrived he was awake and talking. Confused speech, but still. Then paramedics signaled the back of his head to me. His skull was popped open on the back so much that I could see inside. We paged the brain surgeon immediately and the patient was taken directly to the operation theater. Months later I heard from my colleague that he was still alive and had no damages other than some occasional balance problems. Belligerent guy comes in a wheelchair. He doesn't want to be here, he's fucking fine, the party was good, EMS, fucked his evening up. EMS brought him in from a bush party, the guy had a chainsaw stuck in his thigh and shin. Literally jammed in his leg. And severe burns after falling into the bonfire on half his body. The guy was hammered, didn't seem bothered by the fact he was severely burned or had a chainsaw in his leg. He ended up losing the leg below his knee and got a nasty infection from the burn. But still, if his leg wasn't completely fucked, I am convinced he'd have gotten up and tried to fight people. 2 patients that give me faith in what medicine can do when I think about it, both quite young to be so sick. First was a woman who was very pregnant and some genius doc agreed to put her under twilight anesthesia for an elective procedure that definitely could have waited. She went into labor while she was under and from there had everything go wrong, ended up in cardiac arrest. I was transported to my hospital and put on VA ECMO. She was in rough shape when I saw her first. Most people in her condition don't make it. I ended up seeing her a month later walk into my op clinic and I got the creepiest feeling. It was like seeing a ghost. She was fine. Not like most people who come out of the ICU after that kind of stay. The second was a young guy who bled out in the ICU of a sudden hemorrhage. He was pulseless for an hour. Without going into a bunch of details, he required several procedures after that which were risky on their own. It took weeks for him to reboot, but eventually he was responding to stimuli. After a couple of months, he walked out of the hospital. He wasn't dying, he was dead for an hour. That these 2 survived is a testament to modern medical science. That they walked out of the hospital on their own, needing little to no assistance, And with their cognition completely intact, that is a miracle. Not me, but it's this thing my dad used to tell my sister and I. My dad served during the Gulf War and said he had to work on a guy whose head got run over by a tank. What happened was a Marine fell asleep against the treads and the tank drove over him. Guess the fact they were in the sand and wearing a helmet saved him, but only barely. My dad said the guys were still incredibly messed up. He never went into specifics. I work in an ER in Lebanon where the construction safety regulations are a bit lax. A few years back I remember that construction workers were falling off buildings like dominoes. One guy came in having fallen from a few stories up and got impaled by an iron bar that went through the back of his neck and out of his left eye socket. The guy was alive and talkative when he got to our ER. Rushed down to surgery. Apparently, it had missed every vital structure somehow and the guy didn't even lose vision in his eye. Thank you for watching Reddit Space. Please subscribe if you love these Reddit stories.